When we talk about cortical divergence in autism, um, one of the most studied and published areas is on motor control. So when we talk about motor control and functional specialization, what we see in neurodivergent individuals, especially with autism, is primary motor cortex atypical functional organization. We also see body control, differentiation, asymmetry. So top, bottom, and left and right body control show different organization in the brain compared to typical development. Okay, and in terms of functional and sensory motor integration in the brain, we see altered prefrontal functional connectivity. So the way that the prefrontal cortex and the motor areas of the brain are connected, are functionally connected and talking to each other, that's also atypical in autism. How this shows up is difficulties in interoception, which is like an internal physical body awareness, as well as balance and coordination issues. We also see a lot of studies where we see morphological differences in brain structure in the primary motor and somatosensory cortices and inferior parietal cortices, as well as the cerebellum. So gray matter volume and structural differences. On the right here, we see functional connectivity and differentiation of the brain. This is a top view of the motor cortex, and this is a front view. And we see that in the dorsolateral areas of the prefrontal cortex, we see differences between typical development and autism. So this is a recent paper from molecular psychiatry looking at functional connectivity in widespread networks in the brain, comparing between typical development and autism. And what we're seeing is very interesting inter and intra-hemispheric network differences. In terms of intra-hemisphere, so between hemispheres, we see differences in the way that the left and right hemispheres are talking to each other, particularly in the language network. But when we look at how the brain is talking to each other within each hemisphere, we see even more differences between autism individuals and typical development. And so language network and the somatomotor network, so the way sensory processing and motor processing is dealt with, and also the cingulate opercular network, which is connecting the frontomotor sensory as well as the insula. And so this has a lot to do with interoception as well. Another area where cortical divergence in autism is seen is auditory processing, which then affects language processing. So we see that auditory sensitivity is altered. The way that neurons are controlling their excitation and inhibition ratios, we say neural gain modulation, that is seen atypical in autism children. We also see difficulty tracking auditory stimuli changes. So the loudness, the pitch, the yaw, all of these different modalities and dimensions of sound processing becomes challenged in the neurodiverse brain. And this is all, it comes down to the level of neural gain modulation. And so how this comes out in behavior is that there can be difficulty decoding language and processing environmental noise. So we're really seeing here that the behavioral phenotypes that we observe so commonly can be really traced down really to very specific alterations or divergences in the neurobiological level. There's also asymmetrical language processing, so weakened activation in the dominant auditory hemisphere during speech perception, as well as functional connectivity differences. So here we see looking at the primary auditory cortex and projections to the parietal speech processing is different for neurodivergent individuals. And lastly, cortical divergence in autism points to sensory processing differences. So emotional and non-emotional touch differentiation becomes difficult. Somatosensory regions are divergent in their activation patterns we see in studies. hyper and hypoactivation to sensory stimuli, and gating, again, when we talk about excitatory and inhibitory ratios. There are also widespread functional connectivity differences. So we're starting to really see a pattern in the cortical divergences in neurodivergent individuals. A lot of functional connectivity alterations compared to typical development. And we also see that many of these networks are interrelated and interprojecting. This is a simplified schema I like to use to present to parents of neurodivergent children, because sometimes, a lot of the time, they are really focused on the top of this pyramid, especially the Chinese diaspora that we serve. They see the top of this pyramid, and their understanding is that we really need to focus on that. But what I try to explain is that our brain is like a hierarchy of neuroinformation integrating. The ways that the brain are divergent that I shared just now can be looked at as lower level information processing. But we know that affecting these so-called lower level information processing can create bottom-up effects, integrating and improving our higher level cognitive performances. And so this is actually a very simplified premise on which how we build the HFS intervention. Why did I spend so much time talking about brain differences? Because those are exactly the areas that we want to target. So let's move into the HFS core principles and therapeutic elements. Really want to introduce the actual intervention to you now. In short, in summary, HFS stands for the Hope Focus System. It's an AI-supported, personalized, and drug-free intervention system. We support children age 5 to 18, and we address ADHD, ASD, and related attention, sensory processing, and social-emotional challenges. We also integrate multiple strategies that are clinically proven, and we meet multifaceted needs of each neurodiverse child. Our main therapeutic elements include music listening therapy and skill-based exercise training, and we use that to combine with the strong emphasis on building connections and trust with the HFS coach. So the HFS coach is almost like the backbone of the intervention. And part of being human-centered is that we don't put the child to interface with technology. We put the child to interface with a human-to-human connection. And our AI assistance supports the coach in delivering the intervention. HFS supports strength-based development, and we have really great data that indicates improvements in cognitive motor language and social-emotional skills. So one of the core principles that HFS holds really, really strongly is connection and strength-based approach. One of our partners, founding partners, Dr. Ned Hallowell, those of us in the ADHD field would know him. He wrote Driven to Distraction. He's had a teaching post in Harvard for a long time, New York Times bestseller. He was one of the earlier proponents of strength-based approach, looking at neurodevelopmental disorders. And rather than using the medical model, rather than focusing on deficits, dysfunctions, impairments, he really posited to view children in a positive way and discovering strengths and reconnection. And he built this framework called the 5-step cycle of excellence, which looks very simple, but actually extremely powerful, the way that we've seen children change from despair to hope when we really implement such a cycle. And so in the cycle of excellence, the first step is connection. We talked about the different compounded marginalizations of neurodiverse individuals, especially from marginalized or underserved communities. And when they come to our center, sometimes they feel really depressed, unaccepted, they're self-judging. And through connection with our HFS coaches, they actively cultivate connection. And then they start to feel connected and they start to feel secure. So one of the reasons why we have zero attrition rate in our intervention, we have this really high adherence rate, nobody has dropped out of the intervention at all, is because we really build this therapeutic connection. And children, some of them, for the first time in a long time, they start to feel joy. They start to feel happy. They start to feel trust, and they really want to come back. And they don't see it as an intervention. They see it as play, which brings us to our second point. In our second part of the cycle of excellence, we use the strength-based approach where we're not forcing them to do something that they don't want to do. And so we're finding ways in which they are able to participate and be engaged. This lowers children's resistance. We're not forcing anything. We're moving with their current, their flow. And this improves their learning efficiency. So it goes to the third point of our cycle of excellence, which is practice. And when we talk about AI assistance, the AI assistance helps to choose the most suitable activity or kind of modality of intervention at each point of the intervention cycle. And the purpose of this is to create a step-by-step design that supports children so that they are engaged, they are doing something that's attainable, but also they are just challenged enough to feel their effort. And so when children feel the results of persistence and their internal motivation, it enhances their sense of accomplishment. This brings us to the fourth point of the cycle of excellence, which is mastery. And HFS has a very progressive practice system that we talked about just now. And so we help them get to a place of mastery, positive and optimistic attitude. And so children really feel this sense of achievement, and it increases their self-confidence, which then leads to increase of self-validation. They attain mastery in, say, the exercises, the skill-based training that they are doing. It also starts to affect aspects of their life in language, social skills, and emotional regulation, relationships with teachers, peers, and family. And so they're also getting an external validation, and it develops healing, a sense of belonging, and it strengthens their connection with self and others. And this is why it's a cycle, because it brings us back to deepening connection, but now it's stronger. When we talk about connection in the HFS, again, I mentioned the HFS coach. They undergo APA accredited training. We're very happy to have received a 5-year accreditation from the APA. And they undergo a training that helps them not only learn exactly what this population of children really require, but again, the particular community that we're serving that I talked about, and also how to apply, practice, acceptance and connection in the process of delivering the intervention. And so they are really, really key to helping children build confidence and self-esteem. And we see children with regulated emotions and calmer nervous systems. The second core principle in HFS is that we really leverage neuroplasticity. So not only when we target children, we know that their brains are more plastic than in adult life, but the neurobiological levels of ASD etiology that I talked about, or a neurodivergence etiology that I talked about just now, are applied here because we want to target cortical change to induce bottom-up behavioral change. And so when we talk about music listening therapy to target auditory processing, skill-based exercise training to target many different interrelated areas, not just the motor system, these are targeting the neurophysiological level and the physical level. And so on the left, we see cortical systems that our system is designed to induce change in and to stimulate and activate. And on the right side is the behavioral phenotypes that we then start to see changes in.